Thank you very much. Thank you, Tamás and Anna, for inviting me. It's really great to be here. So as you can see from the title of my paper, I'm an international relations scholar broadly, and I'm looking at this issue of cultural diplomacy from the perspective of EU foreign policy, and then particularly during times of crisis. I just finished a book called The Politics of Crisis in Europe that came out with Cambridge a couple months ago. So just to start out, when I read the joint communication and sort of try to grapple with what is culture in this sense, what is culture when it comes to EU foreign policy or external action, it, to me, is understood in a broader sense. It's beyond arts and literature, but also includes a wide range of activities: tourism, education, research, and so on. So cultural diplomacy, taking this one step further, is basically the programs and the various events that promote the exchange of these things, in this case between the EU and third countries. And I think the most relevant part of the joint communication for my purposes is the second prong of the strategy, promoting culture and intercultural dialogue for peaceful inter-community relations. And just to give the basic rundown of how I see cultural diplomacy and its importance, much of this was mentioned yesterday in some of the discussion, but I think we can all understand at a basic level that culture is really important for the promotion of human rights. Just the very act of doing the arts and other forms of expression promotes the freedom of expression. It also shows diversity, and when people absorb the diverse expressions of others, they are really much more in touch with a sense of shared humanity, of appreciation of that diversity. It also leads to empathy, which is an important part of international relations if we're not just going to exist in a kind of realist world. And finally, I would add ultra-sociality, and this refers to much of the literature actually across the hard sciences and some of the social sciences that emphasizes that at core, human beings are very social beings. Yesterday, we discussed a bit how culture could the exchange of culture could either backfire in that you could actually realize that you don't like each other, but it could result in more empathy. So it could go in either directions. It could divide or unite. But I think there is some hope in the fact that human beings are prone to wanting to unite in some way. They want to understand each other and be ultra-social. So they're trying to find commonality. At the same time, and this gets into the ways in which I actually see cultural diplomacy a bit differently than the panel yesterday at the end of the day, in that I think that it has a power dimension to it as well, whether purposeful or not. And one of the ways in which cultural diplomacy is important is I think it works against authoritarianism. And as you know, we're in a period right now after the Brexit and the election of Trump, where there's a sense that the liberal world order is at threat, that perhaps the liberal world order is declining. And in the face of that, I think it is important to develop shared understandings across those countries that appreciate the role of the European Union in the world. And one of the greatest accomplishments of the EU is, of course, democracy and the spread of democracy. So having a kind of cultural engagement and cultural presence across the world for the EU really does actively counter authoritarianism. Another aspect, which is a bit newer, is the cyber and network propaganda, which we see spreading sort of at alarming rates. And what's new about this most recently is that the way in which cyber propaganda in particular works is becoming much more micro and individualized. Investigative journalists have really been able to dig up the processes behind the election of Trump and Brexit, using companies that have highly developed models at targeting individual citizens with automated bots. Cambridge Analytica, Aggregate IQ, companies that people like Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon are involved in, and they're actually trying to influence Europe at the same time. Then you add to this Google and Facebook, which amplify all of this. And then another thing I would mention that really goes along with this is misinformation and psychological operations that often also happen through social media. People tend to remember things that are most sensationalized or most repeated. And this is where cultural diplomacy becomes really important, because it's that long-term engagement of cultural exchange that provides a buffer for crisis. It makes it less likely that people will be drawn into misinformation, fake news, propaganda. So just as Raj described, I think for sure cultural diplomacy fits in with this notion of soft power, defined as sort of attractive power. And I don't think this is something that the EU should really shy away from, because the EU aspires to be an actor on the world stage, and it has to have some form of power, especially soft power, to hold influence in the world. Given that this is an actor that is a force for good, it tries to be a force for good, for peace, stability, development, I think it's necessary for the EU to have soft power. And one thing about the way it does this is, I definitely take the point of the panel last time. You don't want the EU to dominate others or to sort of force its own version of the vast array of European cultures on others. So the key message, the key strategy that the EU does, which I think is very effective for soft power, is it basically says that it's not about propaganda, it's about demonstrating that the EU values its own internal cultural diversity and the many forms of expression that come out of it, even when those forms are critical of the EU. Being able to see European culture as critical even of the EU is the strength of the EU. For instance, I went to the Nobel Peace Institute during the year that the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize, and there was an art and cultural display mainly focused on photography. When I went into the exhibit, I was a little surprised because not all of the photos were beautiful. Some of the photos actually were kind of ugly, and I was thinking, well, this is odd since the EU is being celebrated with the Nobel Peace Prize. But that was the point, to admire the EU for its freedom of expression. And then I would take this even further and say, reflecting upon those last 3 points, there is a limited way in which cultural diplomacy might have to have a hard power element as well. It's limited, but when you're dealing with propaganda, it's necessary to have counter-propaganda to correct for misinformation. When others see culture as a kind of weapon and cultural exchange almost in terms of war, it's necessary for the EU to reclaim the meaning of culture through its narrative and through language, which actually can be a form of hard power. Hard power is defined as getting others to do what they would otherwise not do. So times of crisis, and this really is a little bit from the book that I just mentioned. I put a selection of Economist covers through the years up here. There are many, many more examples of this. So the EU is particularly vulnerable during times of crisis, right? Bad news sells. The more the Economist can put "It's the end of Europe" on the cover of their magazine, the more money they make, right? So there's a kind of popularity in Europe bashing, a sort of self-satisfaction among pundits in the media of saying that Europe is about to fall apart. And when they continually do this over the decades, a meta-narrative has developed that is basically the EU is a huge bureaucracy, it's hard to understand, so there's no point in understanding it. When that happens, you do get self-fulfilling prophecies. You see a contagion effect, for instance, in the Eurozone crisis. You see panic over whether integration can continue, whether the EU can continue. So crises require a public diplomacy response. And I think that there is such a thing as crisis public diplomacy. But it cannot exist alone. The EU cannot simply chase the narrative and try to counter it during the heat of a crisis. So this is where cultural diplomacy is particularly important, because it builds resilience and what I call image resilience for the EU. We're all quite familiar with resilience now because the EU a few years ago started using this term. It's also popular in the US to be able to withstand crises and bounce back. But there's an image dimension of this as well that's really important for public diplomacy. It's about that previous slide, about what the hit that Europe takes in its image every time there is a crisis that really doesn't have to spell the end of the EU. So how through a crisis can the EU maintain its image so it doesn't become as bad as Europe is about to fall apart every couple of years? So image resilience, yeah. That is the meta-narrative that's developed out of bouncing from crisis to crisis. But it's not necessary. That's the point of my book. It's not necessary to be on this image roller coaster for the EU. And I've done an article recently on how the EU did both crisis public diplomacy and relied on long-term public diplomacy during the Eurozone crisis. But I want to move on to the joint communication more concretely. So, you know, I think it is actually relatively easy for the EU to use culture in general terms as attractive power. That, you know, there is a lot of tourism, people want to be educated in Europe, there's a lot of exchange, people around the world immediately recognize the components of European culture. But the joint communication to me makes a stronger effort to use this in a concrete way than in the past. Maybe the timing of it is somewhat about sort of getting past the Eurozone crisis, recognizing that there have been major crises, at least in people's perceptions in the 21st century, and it's time to be more proactive about it. So the key properties that I took away from reading the joint communication are these, and I think we talked about them yesterday. The economic side of it, the sustainable development side, there is a strategic dimension, mainstreaming culture into EU foreign policy, using the EEAS, using cultural institutes, focusing on strategic partners, and then creating these hubs where the EU can leverage existing structures to be stronger in its cultural diplomacy. It's not about reinventing the wheel. There actually are a lot of structures already in place. So this really comes back to that second prong of promoting culture and intercultural dialogue for peaceful intercommunity relations. But in evaluating it, I mean, this is more out of my area because I'm a scholar and not a policymaker, but you know, I think that looking at the activities that have happened since the joint communication less than a year ago, it looks fantastic in terms of diversity and important elements of culture. I see a lot of art, photography, music, film, world heritage, and dialogue. But the two areas in which I thought, you know, as going forward could potentially still be strengthened is while it is nice to have these hubs of influence, in some ways the cultural diplomacy, the impact of that remains contained to those hubs. So the question is how to expand cultural diplomacy to broader society. So that broader society is aware of, you know, as was mentioned yesterday, the 50 activities the EU has done. And secondly, perhaps being more strategic. And one thing I thought about is strategic flexibility. So being able to respond to various developments and trends as they happen through the EU's cultural diplomacy. So as you know, the Pulse of Europe that I mentioned yesterday has emerged organically out of civil society. It has that importance that Raj mentioned, society, people-to-people relations. But the Pulse of Europe is incredibly powerful in my view because, and that's a photo of one of their sort of rallies, because it's anti-nationalist and it's anti-far-right populist. So it's actually in reaction to the thing that everyone fears about the EU right now, which is what if people want to kind of retreat into sort of their own nationalisms. So the Pulse of Europe talks about culture as friendship, and I think the EU can capitalize on these things, connecting the politics that these people represent, these are thousands of people across Europe, to the cultural exchange and the way that they use the EU as a symbol. The EU is more than the sum of its parts. It represents the freedom of expression, it represents the exchange, young people, advancement, progress, going beyond national self-interest and so on. And then finally, just to end with my last slide, looking at current challenges for cultural diplomacy. Because, we tend to think about what is the next potential crisis, what's the next challenge. The first one on here, I think, is already a crisis. It's not a crisis for the EU, but it's a crisis in the transatlantic relationship because of Trump. And what's interesting for this particular conference that we're at is that these Trump supporters talk about culture, and they talk about it in a very hard power way. There is a feeling, maybe since Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, that culture can divide people. And many of the kind of cronies, including Steve Bannon and the founder of Breitbart, talk about culture in a way that says they want to take back culture. They want to wage a cultural and political war. They're against mainstream understandings of politics and values. So Breitbart opened a website in the US. It's an extremist website known for fake news. They then opened a website in the UK and have plans to open the same website in France and Germany, focused at those audiences. So these people speak of weaponizing the narrative. And this is where I think the EU's role is really important in a very strategic way, that cultural diplomacy matters, but the EU doesn't want to let that be the definition of culture. The EU needs to take back the definition of it, so it's not about weaponizing. And the last three items are basically self-explanatory. They're radicalization and recruitment to terrorism, disillusionment or lack of understanding of the European project. This is mainly a perception that outsiders have, that Europeans are disillusioned with the EU, and that results in things like Brexit. But particularly in the US, I, over dinner last night, talked about how basically most Americans think the EU is really done. Like literally, they think it's done. So just to conclude, I think cultural diplomacy is important because, of course, culture is valuable to the human experience itself. It has intrinsic value. It promotes empathy, the ultra-social nature of people across borders, freedom of expression. But cultural engagement with external publics plays a dual role. It's a form of EU foreign policy. It has both soft and hard power benefits, and it's necessary in our current period. If you feel like it's wrong for the EU to exercise power through culture, just think about what China does and what other countries do, the United States. Other countries do not shy away from using culture in a way to influence, and it's important to prevent it from being weaponized. This should be a goal of the EU. So I think the joint communication is a strong platform to begin this and really has the potential to go beyond the hubs and to build resilience for the EU. Thanks very much.